Hi, I'm Celestine Voss. At last Thursday's family dinner in Millbrook Heights, my father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'll never amount to anything, Celestine. Stop embarrassing this family with your ridiculous fantasies." But the real shock wasn't his cruelty. I'd heard that my entire life. It was what happened 47 minutes later when my assistant knocked on their front door, handed me a leather portfolio, and everything my family thought they knew about my life, crumbled like stale bread in their perfectly manicured hands. The silence, the lies, the systematic erasure of who I really was. It all led to that single moment when they realized the failure they'd been mocking for 28 years had been quietly building an empire they couldn't even comprehend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me set the scene for you. The Voss family estate sits on Bramblewood Lane in Millbrook Heights, Connecticut. One of those neighborhoods where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with surgical scissors and the mailboxes cost more than most people's cars. Growing up there meant living under a microscope where image was everything and authenticity was a dirty word. My parents, Harrison and Vivienne Voss, had perfected the art of public perfection while privately tearing down anyone who threatened their carefully constructed narrative, and I was the crack in their foundation that they spent my entire childhood trying to fill with shame and silence. The dining room that Thursday evening was set with the good china, Vivienne's grandmother's Wedgwood that only came out when they wanted to remind someone of their place in the family hierarchy. The chandelier cast that particular kind of harsh light that makes everyone look either angelic or absolutely ghoulish. And trust me, there were no angels at that table. My brother Thaddeus sat to father's right, as always, dressed in his perfectly pressed Armani suit, fresh from his job at the family's investment firm, where he pushed papers and pretended to understand markets. My sister Cordelia perched delicately across from me, her engagement ring catching the light every time she lifted her wine glass, a rock so large it probably had its own gravitational pull, courtesy of her fiancé's old money pharmaceutical fortune. And then there was me, Celestine, the family disappointment. The one who'd chosen to study literature instead of business, who'd moved to a questionable neighborhood in Brooklyn instead of staying in Millbrook Heights, who insisted on wearing vintage dresses instead of designer labels, who had the audacity to pursue writing instead of marrying well and producing grandchildren on schedule. The conversation had started innocently enough. Well, as innocent as anything could be in the Voss household. Vivienne had been detailing Cordelia's wedding planning progress, with the enthusiasm of a military strategist, discussing a successful invasion. Thaddeus had shared updates about his latest big deal at the firm, though from what I could gather, his biggest accomplishment was convincing father to give him yet another promotion he hadn't earned. And then, inevitably, all eyes turned to me. "And what about you, Celestine?" Father had asked in that tone, the one that suggested he already knew the answer would disappoint him. "Still playing writer in that little apartment of yours?" I'd tried to share some genuine good news. A literary magazine had accepted one of my short stories, and I'd been invited to read at a prestigious reading series in Manhattan. But before I could finish explaining the significance of these milestones, Father had cut me off with a wave of his hand, the same gesture he'd used to dismiss me since I was 6 years old and trying to show him a crayon drawing. "Celestine," he'd said, setting down his wine glass with the kind of deliberate precision that meant a lecture was coming. "You're 28 years old. It's time to face reality. You'll never amount to anything with this writing nonsense. You're embarrassing this family, living in squalor, chasing fantasies that will never pay your bills or give you any real standing in society." The words hit, exactly the way they were designed to, like a scalpel finding the exact spot where all my childhood insecurities lived. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they'd been busy dismissing me, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. Something that would make their jaws drop and their perfectly crafted worldview shatter into a million tiny, irrelevant pieces. You see, for the past 3 years, I'd been living a double life. To my family, I was still the struggling writer, barely scraping by, a cautionary tale they could point to whenever they wanted to justify their narrow definition of success. But the truth? The truth was about to walk through their front door and change everything. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very qualities they'd spent decades trying to shame out of me, my creativity, my independence, my refusal to conform to their expectations, had become the foundation of something they'd never seen coming. While Thaddeus was playing with Daddy's money, and Cordelia was planning her picture-perfect wedding, I'd been building an empire from words, authenticity, and the kind of genuine human connection they'd never understood. And in exactly 47 minutes, when my assistant knocked on their door with that leather portfolio full of contracts, earnings statements, and legal documents that would prove just how spectacularly wrong they'd been about their disappointing daughter, the real story was finally going to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. To understand why that Thursday dinner hit so hard, you need to know how the Voss family machine really worked. In our household, love was a performance review, and I'd been failing since kindergarten. My role in this twisted theater was crystal clear. I was the cautionary tale. The example of what happens when you don't follow the family blueprint. While Thaddeus got standing ovations for mediocrity and Cordelia received praise for simply existing beautifully, I was the understudy who never quite learned her lines correctly. Harrison, Voss, father, as we were required to call him even as adults, ruled our family like a Fortune 500 company. Every conversation was a board meeting, every achievement was measured against stock market returns, and every family member had a clearly defined role in maintaining the Voss brand. He'd built his real estate empire on the simple principle that image was everything, and he expected his children to be living billboards for his success. Vivienne, my mother, was the perfect CEO's wife. All sharp angles and sharper words, wrapped in Chanel and disappointment. She'd perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the concerned sigh, the way of making you feel grateful for criticism. Her specialty was public humiliation disguised as maternal concern. Oh, Celestine's going through her artistic phase. She'd tell anyone who'd listen, the way other mothers might discuss a child's unfortunate acne. Thaddeus had been groomed since birth to inherit the kingdom. At 31, he was already vice president of development at Voss Holdings, a title that sounded impressive until you realized it meant he approved color schemes for strip malls and took credit for deals his subordinates closed. But he looked the part, tall, blonde, square-jawed, like he'd been ordered from a catalog of acceptable sons. When he succeeded, it was destiny. When he failed, it was a learning experience that built character. Cordelia, 3 years older than me, had chosen the other acceptable path for Voss daughters, marrying well. Her engagement to Reginald Ashworth III was treated like a corporate merger, which, let's be honest, it basically was. Ashworth Pharmaceuticals plus Voss Real Estate equaled a dynasty that would make the society pages swoon. She'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow her ability to plan charity galas and choose the right silverware patterns made her more valuable to the family than any career I could imagine. And then there was me. The glitch in their perfect system. From the time I could hold a crayon, I was different. While Thaddeus played with toy bulldozers and Cordelia dressed up in mother's jewelry, I was scribbling stories in notebooks, creating entire worlds where families actually listened to each other. When other kids were watching cartoons, I was reading everything I could get my hands on. Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Maya Angelou, women who'd used words to change the world. My parents tolerated this phase until it became clear it wasn't a phase at all. When I chose English literature over business at Yale, the disappointment was palpable. When I graduated summa cum laude but announced I was moving to Brooklyn to write, The family meeting that followed felt like a funeral for their expectations. "Writing is a hobby, not a career," Father had declared, the same way he might announce that the sky was blue. "No daughter of mine is going to live like some bohemian artist, embarrassing this family with poverty and delusions of grandeur." But I went anyway, and with each year that passed, each family gathering where I showed up in vintage clothes instead of designer labels, each holiday where I couldn't produce a suitable boyfriend or a real job, my status in the family hierarchy dropped lower and lower. The pattern was always the same. They'd ask about my life with the enthusiasm of someone inquiring about a terminal illness. I'd share small victories, a story published, a reading invitation, a freelance project, and they'd respond with sighs and suggestions that maybe it was time to be realistic and consider law school, or at least find a nice man to take care of me. What they never seemed to understand was that their dismissal had become my fuel. Every eye roll, every concerned suggestion, every time they introduced me as our daughter who's still figuring things out, it all went into a growing fire inside me that burned hotter each year. At family functions, I'd watch them perform their roles flawlessly. Father holding court with other business owners, Mother orchestrating conversations like a symphony conductor, Thaddeus networking with the confidence of someone who'd never had to earn his place, Cordelia glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who'd successfully monetized her beauty and breeding. And I'd sit there, smiling politely, playing the part of the family disappointment, while inside I was building something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. They saw failure where I saw foundation. They saw embarrassment where I saw authenticity. They saw a daughter who'd never amount to anything, while I was quietly becoming everything they'd never dreamed possible. But that Thursday night, something in Father's tone was different, meaner, more final, like he'd grown tired of waiting for me to come to my senses and had decided it was time to cut his losses completely. The words, "You'll never amount to anything," weren't just criticism. They were a verdict, a closing of the book on any possibility that I might someday surprise them. What he didn't know was that the book was about to be reopened, and the final chapter was going to be written by the daughter he'd just written off forever. The silence that followed Father's declaration stretched across the dining room like spilled wine, dark and impossible to clean up. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, that combination of shame and rage that had been my constant companion at family gatherings for the past decade. But this time, something was different. This time, instead of shrinking into myself, like I usually did, I felt something sharper, cleaner. Clarity. "Embarrassing the family," I repeated slowly, setting down my fork with deliberate precision. "That's interesting, Father, because I wasn't aware that pursuing my passion while supporting myself independently was somehow a reflection on your reputation." Vivienne's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly, not from surprise at my words, but from surprise that I dared to respond at all. Typically, when Father delivered one of his verdicts, the rest of us were expected to nod solemnly and accept his wisdom as gospel. Pushback wasn't part of the family protocol. "Supporting yourself?" Thaddeus let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Come on, Celeste. We all know you're barely scraping by in that shoebox apartment. Mother told us about the time she visited you, and you were eating ramen noodles for dinner, at 28. The memory he referenced hit like a slap. 6 months ago, Vivienne had shown up unannounced at my Brooklyn apartment, a rare occurrence that should have been my first warning that something was amiss. She'd taken one look at my modest one-bedroom space, my secondhand furniture, my simple dinner preparation, and had somehow transformed it into evidence of my life's fundamental failure. What she hadn't seen, what none of them had ever bothered to look for, was the state-of-the-art laptop hidden in my bedroom, the stack of contracts in my desk drawer, or the business bank statements that would have made their heads spin. Ramen noodles, Cordelia chimed in with that particular tone she reserved for discussing things beneath her station. Really, Celestine, at some point, don't you think it's time to admit that this whole writing thing just isn't working out? I mean, how long can you pretend that poverty is some kind of noble artistic statement? I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA but felt like complete strangers. They saw my life through such a narrow lens, filtering everything through their own values of visible wealth and social status. To them, success looked like Thaddeus's corner office that he'd inherited rather than earned, or Cordelia's engagement, to someone whose last name appeared on prescription bottles. They couldn't conceive of a success that didn't come with obvious external markers: the right address, the right car, the right clothes, the right last name. You want to know what's embarrassing? I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. What's embarrassing is sitting at this table, listening to people who claim to love me, systematically tear down everything I've worked for without having the slightest idea what that work actually entails. Father's face darkened. In the Voss household, disagreement with the patriarch wasn't just discouraged. It was considered a form of treason. Celestine, you will not take that tone with me in my own house. I've watched you waste your 20s on this fantasy, and I'm tired of pretending it's anything other than an elaborate form of unemployment. Fantasy? The word escaped before I could stop it, loaded with 3 years of carefully guarded secrets. You think what I do is fantasy? Something in my tone must have shifted, because suddenly all 3 of them were looking at me with sharper attention. Vivienne's head tilted slightly, like a predator sensing unexpected movement from what she'd assumed was easy prey. I think, Father continued, clearly building toward the kind of pronouncement he loved to make, that it's time for some tough love. You're going to be 30 soon, Celestine. You have no husband, no real career, no prospects. You're living like a college student while your siblings are building actual lives. It's time to grow up. Grow up, I repeated, and I could hear something dangerous in my own voice. Like Thaddeus, who's never worked anywhere except the company you handed. Him? Like Cordelia, whose biggest accomplishment is getting engaged to someone with a trust fund. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Thaddeus's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Cordelia's mouth fell open in a perfect little O of shock. But it was Vivienne's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of her usual sharp rebuke, she was studying me with something that looked almost like curiosity. How dare you? Father's voice was low and controlled, which somehow made it more threatening than if he'd shouted. How dare you sit at my table, eating food I paid for, and insult your siblings who've made something of themselves. Made something of themselves? I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. What exactly have they made, Father? What have any of you actually built? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've all been playing dress-up, with money and connections that were handed to you, while I've been out in the real world actually creating something from nothing. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. For a moment, nobody moved. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time, the subtle hum of the air conditioning, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Creating something? Vivienne's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Darling, what exactly do you think you've created? A collection of rejection letters? A portfolio of stories that 12 people have read? That's when I almost broke. Almost told them everything right there, about the contracts, the advances, the movie deals, the bestseller lists they'd never bothered to check because they'd already decided I was a failure. Almost pulled out my phone and showed them the bank balance that would have made Thaddeus's salary look like pocket change. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the cruel satisfaction in Vivienne's eyes, or the way Father was leaning back in his chair like he'd just delivered a killing blow, or the way my siblings were watching this destruction with the fascination of people watching a car accident. You want to know what I've created? I said instead, my voice eerily calm. You'll find out soon enough. Father laughed. Actually laughed. Is that supposed to be some kind of threat? What are you going to do, Celestine? Write a strongly worded blog post about your mean family? I picked up my purse from the floor beside my chair, checking my phone as I did. The text message I'd been waiting for was there, sent just 3 minutes ago. Arriving in 10 minutes. Documents ready. Marcus? No, I said, slinging my purse over my shoulder. I'm not going to write anything. But in about 7 minutes, you're going to get a very interesting visitor who's going to explain exactly what your daughter has been up to while you've been busy dismissing her. The confused looks they exchanged might have been funny under different circumstances. Thaddeus glanced at Cordelia, who looked at Vivienne, who turned to Father with a barely perceptible shrug. Celestine. Father's voice carried that warning. Tone he'd used since I was 5 years old. Sit down. We're not finished here. Actually, I said, walking toward the dining room door. We are. But don't worry. The real conversation is about to begin. I left them sitting there in their perfectly appointed dining room, surrounded by their perfectly curated life, with no idea that their perfectly controlled narrative was about to be completely rewritten by the daughter they'd just spent the last hour demolishing. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear the murmur of confused voices behind me, but I didn't turn around. In 6 minutes, Marcus would knock on their door with a leather portfolio full of documents that would prove everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. I stepped out onto their manicured front porch and took a deep breath of the evening air. After 28 years of being the family disappointment, I was finally ready to show them exactly what disappointment really looked like. The moment I stepped onto the front porch, my phone exploded. The first text came from Vivienne before I'd even reached the circular driveway. Come back inside this instant. Your father is livid. Then Thaddeus. What the hell was that about? You've really done it now. Followed immediately by Cordelia. I can't believe you embarrassed us like that. Reginald's parents are coming to dinner next week. I silenced the phone and slipped it into my purse, but I could feel it continuing to vibrate like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. 28 years of careful family management had just imploded in the span of 10 minutes, and they were scrambling to contain the damage in the only way they knew how, with guilt, pressure, and the assumption that I would eventually crawl back and apologize for disturbing their perfectly orchestrated evening. Standing there on the front steps of the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by the manicured perfection of Bramblewood Lane, I felt a strange disconnect from reality. The evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of expensive landscaping and the distant sound of automatic sprinklers maintaining other people's perfect lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where problems were solved quietly, behind closed doors, where messy emotions were smoothed over with the right connections and enough money to make inconvenient truths disappear. But as I walked down the stone pathway toward the street, every step felt like I was shedding skin. The weight of their expectations, their disappointment, their constant need to minimize who I was, it was all falling away, leaving something raw and exposed, but also strangely powerful. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Father. I watched his name flash on the screen. Harrison Voss in those stark capital letters that had intimidated me since childhood, and for the first time in my adult life, I declined the call. The simple act of pressing that red button felt like jumping off a cliff. 3 more calls followed in rapid succession. Vivienne, Thaddeus, Cordelia. I declined them all, each rejection feeling easier than the last. By the 4th attempt from Father, I'd walked far enough down Bramblewood Lane that their house was just another perfectly lit mansion among many, no longer the towering monument to respectability that had dominated my entire existence. I found myself sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the Ashworth estate. Ironically, the property belonging to Cordelia's future in-laws. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally sitting on the foundation of another family fortune while contemplating the destruction of my relationship with my own family fortune. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Thy. Texts were coming faster now, each one more desperate than the last. Vivienne, this behavior is completely unacceptable. We raised you better than this. Thaddeus, Dad's talking about cutting you off completely. Is that what you want? Cordelia, I don't understand what's gotten into you, but you need to fix this before Reginald's family hears about it. Cut me off completely. The threat that had hung over my head like a sword for my entire adult life. The ultimate punishment. That was supposed to bring me to my knees, force me to conform, make me choose between my integrity and my family's conditional love. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, reading those words on my phone screen, I realized something that should have terrified me but instead filled me with an odd sense of peace. I didn't care anymore. For 28 years, I'd lived in fear of that threat. Every time I'd chosen literature over business, Brooklyn over Millbrook Heights, authenticity over image, the specter of being cut off had lurked in the background. It was the nuclear option they'd never quite deployed, but had wielded like a weapon to keep me in line. Now that it was finally on the table, explicitly stated in Thaddeus's text message, I could see it for what it really was. An empty threat, designed to control someone who had already broken free. My phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number with a Connecticut area code. I almost declined it automatically, assuming it was one of them calling from a different phone, but something made me answer. Celestine? The voice was female, older, uncertain. This is Margaret Ashworth, Cordelia's future mother-in-law. I hope I'm not overstepping, but Vivienne just called me in quite a state. She said there had been some kind of family emergency involving you. I closed my eyes. Of course. Within 30 minutes of my departure, Vivienne had already begun damage control, reaching out to their social circle to craft a narrative that would preserve the family's reputation while painting me as the unstable element that needed to be managed. Mrs. Ashworth, I said carefully, I'm not sure what my mother told you, but there's no emergency. I simply left dinner early after a disagreement. Oh. There was a long pause. Well, Vivienne seemed to think. She mentioned something about you having some kind of breakdown. She was quite concerned about your mental state. Mental state. The oldest trick in the Voss family playbook. When they couldn't control someone through guilt or financial pressure, they questioned their sanity. I'd watched them do it to business partners who disagreed with father's contracts, to country club members who'd challenged mother's event planning, to anyone who dared to suggest that the Voss way might not be the only way. I assure you, Mrs. Ashworth, my mental state is perfectly fine. In fact, I'd say it's clearer than it's been in years. Well, that's good to hear, dear. Vivienne also mentioned that you might be going through some financial difficulties. She thought perhaps the stress of that might be affecting your judgment? Financial difficulties, another classic Voss deflection technique. Paint the dissenter as desperate, unstable, making poor decisions because of money problems. Never mind that I'd been financially independent for 3 years running. Never mind that I'd never asked them for a single dollar since moving to Brooklyn. Mrs. Ashworth, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that my finances are perfectly stable. Whatever my mother told you, I think there may have been some miscommunication. Another pause. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from concerned confusion to something sharper, more calculating. Celestine, I hope you understand that with the wedding coming up, we all need to be very careful about anything that might create unnecessary drama or negative attention. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern for my well-being, but concern for their social standing. The Ashworth-Voss wedding was going to be the social event of the season in Millbrook. Heights, and they couldn't afford to have the bride's unstable sister causing scenes or generating gossip. I understand completely, I said. And I can promise you that I have no intention of creating any drama around Cordelia's wedding. What I didn't say was that by the time the wedding rolled around in 3 months, they might have bigger things to worry about than my potential for social disruption. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, watching the lights come on in the massive houses around me. Each perfectly lit window represented a family, presumably full of people who understood their roles, who played their parts, who maintained the delicate social ecosystem that kept places like Millbrook Heights functioning smoothly. But I was done playing my part. And in about 2 minutes, when Marcus arrived with his leather portfolio full of documents, the Voss family was about to discover what happened when their carefully maintained social ecosystem encountered a force they'd never seen coming. My phone buzzed one final time. A text from Marcus. "Pulling into the driveway now. Are you ready for this?" I looked back toward the house where I'd grown up, where 3 people were probably still sitting around that dining room table, trying to figure out how to manage the damage I'd just caused to their evening. I typed back, "More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life." The daughter they'd written off was about to rewrite their entire understanding of success, failure, and exactly who in this family had been living in a fantasy. As I waited for Marcus to make his way to the front door, my mind drifted back to the moment when I first understood that love in the Voss family came with conditions I was never going to meet. I was 7 years old, sitting in the back seat of Mother's silver Mercedes, still wearing my blue ribbon from the Millbrook Heights elementary school creative writing contest. The ribbon felt enormous pinned to my small chest, and I kept touching it to make sure it was real. I'd written a story about a little girl who could talk to books, and they talked back, telling her all the secrets hidden in their pages. Mrs. Henderson, my teacher, had called it remarkably imaginative and sophisticated beyond her years. I'd been so proud that I'd practically floated to the car, clutching my certificate and the small trophy they'd given me. "Tell Daddy about your ribbon, sweetheart," Vivienne had said as we pulled into the driveway of our Bramblewood Lane estate. But her tone was the same one she used when she asked me to thank the housekeeper. Polite but distant, like she was checking an item off a list. I'd burst through the front door, ribbon flying, trophy held high, ready to share my triumph with Father. He was in his study, as always, surrounded by architectural plans and property surveys, the tools of building his real estate empire. When I knocked on his door and announced my victory, he'd looked up from his papers with what I thought was interest. "A writing contest?" he'd repeated slowly, examining my ribbon. "Well, that's nice, Celestine. Nice. Not impressive, not remarkable, not the enthusiastic praise that Thaddeus received when he scored a single goal in his soccer league, or that Cordelia got for simply looking pretty in her dance recital costume. Just nice. Mrs. Henderson says I might be a real writer someday," I'd announced, bouncing on my toes with excitement. That's when Father's expression had changed. The mild interest vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Celestine," he'd said, setting down my trophy on his desk like it was made of tissue paper. "Writing stories is a lovely hobby for a little girl, but you need to understand that hobbies don't pay bills or build legacies. Smart girls like you should be thinking about more practical things." Even at 7, I'd felt the sting of dismissal, but I was too young to understand that this wasn't about protecting me from disappointment. It was about protecting the family from having a daughter who didn't fit their definition of success. The pattern continued throughout my childhood, so consistent that I began to think it was normal. When I won the statewide poetry competition at 12, beating out hundreds of other students, Mother had managed to turn even that victory into a gentle correction. "It's wonderful that you enjoy expressing yourself, darling, but we wouldn't want you to get so focused on these little competitions that you neglect your real studies." Real studies. As if the hours I spent crafting poems, the way I could make words dance and sing and tell truths that regular conversation couldn't reach, somehow wasn't real. As if the recognition I was receiving from teachers, from published poets who judged these contests, from literary magazines that started accepting my work when I was 15, was all just elaborate make-believe. Meanwhile, Thaddeus could barely string together a coherent paragraph for his high school English essays, but when he was accepted to Yale on the strength of father's alumni donation, the celebration lasted for weeks. Cordelia never showed particular talent for anything beyond looking beautiful and saying the right things at the right times, but every charity event she attended, every society photograph she appeared in, was treated like a major accomplishment, worthy of family pride. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was how they actively worked to diminish whatever success I did achieve. When I was 16 and published my first short story in a respected literary journal, Father had actually frowned when I showed him the magazine. "Celestine," he'd said, "I hope you're not putting too much stock in these little publications. Anyone can get something printed these days. What matters is building something substantial, something that will last." Something substantial. Something that will last. The irony was almost unbearable now, sitting here 3 years later, knowing what I'd built while they'd been busy dismissing everything I touched. But the moment that crystallized everything, the memory that made tonight's dinner table scene feel inevitable rather than shocking, had happened during my junior year at Yale. I'd been awarded the prestigious Whitmore Fellowship for Emerging Writers, an honor given to only one undergraduate. In the entire Ivy League each year, the fellowship came with a $25,000 stipend, mentorship from established authors, and virtually guaranteed admission to any graduate writing program in the country. I'd called home immediately, breathless with excitement, ready to share news that even they would have to acknowledge as significant. The fellowship was competitive, prestigious, the kind of achievement that opened doors to literary careers that could span decades. "A fellowship," Vivienne had repeated when I'd explained it to her. "For writing. How much does it pay?" When I'd told her about the stipend, there had been a long pause. Then, "Well, that's lovely, dear. Your father just closed a deal worth $12 million. Maybe you two can compare notes about success." $12 million. That was her response to what should have been one of the proudest moments of my academic career. Not congratulations, not pride, not recognition that her daughter had achieved something remarkable. Just a casual reminder that in the Voss family, my greatest professional triumph was pocket change compared to Father's ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That night, I'd sat in my dorm room, staring at the fellowship letter, and realized something that should have broken my heart, but instead filled me with a strange kind of clarity. They were never going to see me. No matter what I accomplished, no matter how many awards I won or prestigious programs I was accepted into, they would always find a way to minimize it, to translate it into their language of money and social status, to make it small enough that it couldn't threaten their narrative about what constituted real success. But what they didn't understand, what they had never bothered to discover, was that their dismissal had taught me something invaluable. It had taught me to stop seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. It had forced me to find my own definition of worth, my own measures of success, my own community of people who understood that creating something meaningful was more important than inheriting something impressive. While they'd been busy making sure I understood that my achievements didn't matter, I'd been quietly building relationships with editors, publishers, agents, and fellow writers who understood exactly how much they did matter. While they'd been teaching me that my dreams were impractical fantasies, I'd been turning those fantasies into contracts, advances, and opportunities they couldn't even imagine. The fellowship had been just the beginning. It had led to my first book deal, which had led to my second, which had led to the movie options, the foreign rights sales, the kind of success that was substantial enough to last several lifetimes. But I'd learned early not to share any of it with them. because sharing it would only invite them to diminish it, to find ways to make it smaller than their own achievements. So I'd let them believe their own story about me. Let them think I was struggling, scraping by, living the impoverished life of an unsuccessful artist. It was easier than trying to convince them that their definition of failure looked exactly like my definition of freedom. As I sat there in the darkness, waiting for Marcus to deliver the documents that would finally force them to confront the truth, I thought about that 7-year-old girl with her blue ribbon, so desperate for their approval. She'd deserved better than nice. She deserved parents who understood that creativity wasn't a consolation prize for people who couldn't succeed in the real world. It was a gift that could reshape the world itself. Tonight, she was finally going to get the recognition she'd always deserved, just not from the people she'd originally hoped would give it to her. The sound of Marcus's footsteps on the front walkway snapped me back to the present, but before I could move toward the house, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized with a sinking feeling: Dr. Patricia Newberry, the family therapist Vivienne had insisted we all see after Father's heart attack 2 years ago. Even in crisis mode, my mother's first instinct was to weaponize mental health professionals. "Celestine, dear." Dr. Newberry's voice was honey-smooth and professionally concerned. "Your mother just called me. She's quite worried about you. She mentioned that you've been displaying some concerning behaviors this evening. Anger, defiance, possibly some paranoid thinking. Paranoid thinking." I almost laughed. Vivienne had managed to turn my finally standing up for myself into symptoms of mental illness in less than an hour. It was masterful, really, the way she could transform any challenge to the family narrative into evidence that the challenger was unstable rather than justified. "Dr. Newberry," I said, watching Marcus approach the front door with his leather portfolio, "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you that my thinking is perfectly clear. Clearer than it's been in years, actually. Sometimes when we're in crisis, we don't realize how our perception might be skewed," she continued in that gentle, patronizing tone that therapists use when they've already decided you're having a breakdown. "Your mother mentioned that you made some rather grandiose claims about your career, about having some kind of success that no one in your family was aware of. That kind of magical thinking can sometimes be a sign of underlying stress or depression. Magical thinking, grandiose claims. The clinical terminology that could transform my actual accomplishments into symptoms of delusion." I wondered what else Vivienne had told her. Probably that I was having fantasies about wealth and success, that I was claiming to have achievements that didn't exist, that I was spinning elaborate stories to avoid facing the reality of my failures. "Dr. Newberry, what exactly did my mother tell you about my career?" "Well, she mentioned that you've been struggling financially, living in substandard housing, working inconsistently. She's concerned that the stress of that situation might be causing you to embellish certain aspects of your professional life." Embellish. That was a polite way of saying lie. Vivienne had painted me as a delusional failure who was making up stories about success to cope with the shame of my actual circumstances. And Dr. Newberry, who had only ever heard the family's version of events, had no reason to question that narrative. "I think there may have been some miscommunication about my circumstances," I said carefully, "but I appreciate your concern. Celestine, I'd like you to consider coming in for a session tomorrow morning, just to talk through whatever's been troubling you. Your mother is quite concerned, and after what she's described, I think it would be beneficial for us to—" I hung up. The implications of that phone call settled over me like ice water. Vivienne wasn't just angry about my behavior at dinner. She was building a case. Within an hour of my departure, she'd already contacted Cordelia's future mother-in-law and the family therapist, spinning a narrative about my mental instability. That would explain away anything I might say or do in the coming days. It was a brilliant preemptive strike. If I tried to tell anyone about my actual success, about the contracts and the money and the career they knew nothing about, it would just be dismissed as the fantasies of an unstable person who couldn't cope with reality. If I produced evidence, it would be explained away as elaborate fabrications from someone who was clearly having some kind of breakdown. My phone buzzed with a text from Thaddeus. "Mom's really worried about you. She thinks you might be having some kind of episode. Maybe you should talk to someone." An episode. That was the family's new official terminology for my refusal to accept their treatment. Not growth, not self-respect, not the natural consequence of 28 years of dismissal. An episode. Another text. This one from Cordelia. "I don't know what's gotten into you tonight, but this isn't like you. You're usually so quiet and agreeable. Maybe the stress of your situation is finally getting to you?" The stress of my situation. Even Cordelia, who had the emotional intelligence of a decorative throw pillow, was participating in the campaign to reframe my behavior as evidence of mental breakdown rather than legitimate anger. But it was the text from Father that made my blood run cold. "Your mother is concerned about your welfare. We've discussed the possibility of a temporary intervention if your behavior continues to deteriorate. We only want what's best for you." Intervention. The ultimate weapon in the Voss family arsenal. They couldn't control me with guilt or threats anymore, so now they were considering having me declared mentally incompetent. It was exactly the kind of nuclear option that wealthy families used when one of their members stepped too far out of line. Remove the threat by removing their credibility, their autonomy, their legal right to make their own decisions. I could see the whole strategy unfolding. Dr. Newberry would document my grandiose delusions and disconnection from reality. Other family friends would be contacted, asked to share their concerns about my increasingly erratic behavior. Medical professionals would be consulted about my deteriorating mental state. And eventually, if I continued to resist their control, they might even seek legal guardianship, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. It was exactly what had happened to Father's sister, Aunt Rosalind, 15 years ago. She'd challenged Father's management of their parents' estate, questioned some of his business decisions, and suggested that maybe the family money should be distributed more equitably among all the heirs. Within 6 months, she'd been painted as unstable, bitter, possibly suffering from early-onset dementia. The family had rallied around the narrative that she wasn't thinking clearly, that she needed protection from her own poor judgment. Aunt Rosalind had spent the last decade living in a care facility that was really just a luxurious prison, cut off from family business, her concerns dismissed as the ravings of someone who couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions. She'd died 3 years ago, and I'd been the only family member to attend her funeral. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I let it go to voicemail, but within seconds, it was ringing. Again from a different number. They were mobilizing their entire network, calling in favors, activating relationships, building a wall of concerned voices that would all tell the same story. Celestine Voss was having a breakdown, losing touch with reality, making grandiose claims about a success that didn't exist. By tomorrow morning, half of Millbrook Heights would have heard that Harrison Voss's youngest daughter was having some kind of mental health crisis, that she was creating scenes, making wild claims, possibly becoming dangerous to herself or others. The narrative would be so consistent, so well coordinated, that anyone who heard it would automatically assume it was true. It was psychological warfare of the highest order, and they were masters at it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly anticipate, was that in about 30 seconds, Marcus was going to knock on their door with documentation that would prove every grandiose delusion I'd allegedly been having. Bank statements showing income that exceeded Father's best years. Publishing contracts that would make their real estate deals look like lemonade stand transactions. Movie options worth more than Cordelia's engagement ring. They thought they were dealing with their familiar scapegoat, the daughter who would eventually cave under pressure and accept whatever narrative they imposed on her reality. They had no idea they were about to confront a successful businesswoman who had spent 3 years carefully documenting every transaction, every contract, every proof of the empire she'd built while they'd been busy dismissing her. I could hear Marcus's footsteps on the front porch now, the confident stride of someone who was about to deliver news that would change everything. I looked back toward the house where my family was probably still sitting around that dining room table, congratulating themselves on how quickly they'd managed the crisis I'd created. In 10 minutes, they were going to discover that the only crisis was their complete misunderstanding of who their daughter really was. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from Vivienne. "We're here when you're ready to face reality, darling." I typed back, "Reality is about to knock on your door." The knock on the front door was crisp and professional. 3 measured raps that echoed through the evening. Air. I could hear movement inside the house, footsteps crossing the marble foyer, and then Father's voice, muffled but audible through the heavy oak door. "Good evening. I'm Marcus Blackwell from Pinnacle Literary Management. I have some documents for Miss Celestine Voss." There was a pause, and I could practically hear the confusion in the silence. Pinnacle Literary Management wasn't a name that would mean anything to them, but the professional tone, the unexpected formality of a business visit at 9 o'clock, on a Thursday evening, it would be completely outside their framework for understanding my life. "I'm her father." Harrison's voice carried that particular note of authority he used when dealing with service people or anyone he considered beneath his station. "I can accept whatever documents you have." "I'm sorry, sir, but these are confidential. Materials that require Miss Voss's personal signature. Is she available?" I could hear the door closing, followed by urgent whispered conversation. Then footsteps moving rapidly toward the back of the house, probably Father going to consult with Vivienne about this unexpected development. Marcus remained on the front porch, patient and professional, while inside the house, I could imagine the family trying to process this disruption to their evening of managing my mental health crisis. My phone rang. Father's name on the screen. "Celestine." His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the undercurrent of irritation. "There's a gentleman here with some kind of documents for you. What is this about?" "I told you earlier that you'd be getting a visitor who would explain what I've been up to. This is ridiculous. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. Come back inside so we can discuss this like adults." Like adults. The phrase that had been used to shut down my opinions and feelings since childhood. Come back inside and let us explain why your reality isn't real, why your feelings aren't valid, why your perspective doesn't matter. "I'll come inside," I said, but only to collect my documents. I hung up before he could respond and walked back toward the house I'd left, less than an hour ago. But everything felt different now. The perfectly manicured lawn, the imposing columns, the heavy front door that had always seemed designed to keep the outside world at bay. It all looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. Marcus stood at attention beside the door, a tall black man in his early 40s wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit. His presence on the front porch of the Voss estate was striking, not because he looked out of place, but because he looked exactly like the kind of high-powered professional who usually visited to discuss major business deals, which, I realized, with some satisfaction, was exactly what he was. "Miss Voss," he said with a slight smile, extending his hand. "Perfect timing. I have everything you requested." "Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate you making the drive out here." Father opened the door before I could reach for the handle, his face a mask of controlled confusion. Behind him, I could see Vivienne hovering in the hallway, with Thaddeus and Cordelia, flanking her like backup singers waiting for their cue. "Mr. Blackwell," Father said, his tone shifting to the one he used for business negotiations, cordial but cautious. "Harrison Voss. I understand you have some documents for my daughter?" "I do indeed, Mr. Voss. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard quite a bit about your family." The way Marcus said it, warm but somehow loaded with meaning, made father's eyebrows rise slightly. This wasn't the tone of someone delivering legal papers for an eviction or debt collection, which I suspected had been his first assumption. This was the tone of someone who knew secrets. "Please come in." Vivienne appeared beside father, her hostess instincts overriding her confusion. "Can we offer you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "That's very kind, Mrs. Voss, but I won't be staying long. I just need Miss Voss to review and sign a few time-sensitive documents." We moved into the living room, the formal one that was only used for important guests and uncomfortable conversations. Father gestured for Marcus to take a seat on the pristine white sofa, while the rest of the family arranged themselves in what looked like a defensive formation. "So," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying that forced casualness that meant he was fishing for information. "Pinnacle Literary Management. That's quite a distinguished name. What kind of services do you provide?" Marcus smiled, setting his leather portfolio on the glass coffee table. "We're a full-service literary agency and management company. We handle everything from book contracts and film rights to international licensing and brand partnerships for our authors." Authors. The word hung in the air like a revelation. I could see the family processing this information, trying to reconcile it with their understanding of my life as a struggling wannabe writer. "How interesting," Vivienne said, her voice taking on that particular quality it got when she was trying to extract information while maintaining plausible deniability. "And you work with many authors?" "We're quite selective, actually. Pinnacle only represents about 30 clients worldwide. We focus on high-earning, established authors with significant commercial and critical success." High-earning, established, significant success. Each word was a small explosion in the carefully constructed narrative they'd built about my life. Cordelia leaned forward slightly. "And you're here because Miss Voss is one of our most successful clients," Marcus said simply. "And we have some rather exciting developments to discuss regarding her latest contracts." The silence that followed was profound. I could see them all trying to process this information, to fit it into their understanding of who I was supposed to be. The struggling artist living in a shoebox apartment, eating ramen noodles, failing to make anything of herself. Father was the first to recover. "I think there may be some confusion, Mr. Blackwell. My daughter is, well, she's been pursuing writing as a hobby, but she hasn't had any significant commercial success." "Oh, I think you'd be quite surprised, Mr. Voss. Celestine has been our client for 3 years now, and in that time she's become one of the most profitable authors in contemporary literary fiction." Most profitable. Contemporary literary fiction. The terms that represented everything they'd dismissed as impractical, unmarketable, unrealistic. "I'm sorry," Vivienne's voice was strained, "but I think there's been some mistake. Celestine lives in a very modest apartment in Brooklyn. She's been struggling financially." Marcus turned to look at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. "How much do you want me to reveal? How far do you want to take this?" I nodded slightly. "Mrs. Voss," Marcus said gently, "I think perhaps your daughter has been modest about her circumstances. The apartment in Brooklyn is actually a 3-bedroom penthouse that she purchased outright 2 years ago. As for struggling financially..." He opened his portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "These are her earnings from just the last quarter." He placed the document on the coffee table, face up. Even from across the room, I could see Father's eyes widening as he took in the numbers. "That's..." Thaddeus's voice cracked slightly. "That's more than the firm made last quarter." "It's been an exceptional year," Marcus agreed. The film rights to her second novel just sold to Netflix for 7 figures, and we're currently negotiating international publishing deals that should double her current annual income. Film rights. 7 figures. Netflix. International deals. Each revelation was like watching a controlled demolition of everything they thought they knew about my life. But Cordelia's voice was small, confused. She drives that old Honda. She wears clothes from thrift stores. Some people prefer not to display their wealth ostentatiously, Marcus said with professional diplomacy. Miss Voss has always been very private about her success. Private. That was a kind way of saying that I'd learned not to share anything meaningful with people who would only find ways to diminish it. Father was staring at the earnings statement like it was written in a foreign language. Celestine, he said slowly, is this real? For the first time since Marcus had arrived, all eyes were on me. And for the first time in my adult life, I was looking at my family from a position of undeniable strength. It's real, Father. All of it. The books, the contracts, the money, the success you've spent my entire life telling me I'd never achieve. It's all real. The room fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different. Not the silence of dismissal or disbelief, but the silence of people whose entire worldview was shifting beneath their feet. Vivienne was the first to speak, and when she did, her voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Uncertainty. Why didn't you tell us? Vivienne's question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Why didn't you tell us? But before I could answer, I watched something shift in her expression. The initial shock was giving way to something else. Calculation, the same look she got when she was planning a charity auction or orchestrating a social event. The wheels were turning, and I could practically see her reformulating the entire evening's narrative. Of course, she continued, her voice becoming warmer, more maternal. You've always been so modest, so private about your achievements. We should have realized. She trailed off, shaking her head with what looked like fond exasperation. Our brilliant daughter, keeping us in suspense all this time. Brilliant daughter. The words that had never been applied to me in 28 years were suddenly flowing like honey. But I recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when she needed something from the country club board, or when she was softening up a potential donor for one of her causes. Father was studying the earnings statement with the intensity of someone reading a contract. This Netflix deal, he said slowly. 7 figures. That's substantial. Very substantial, Marcus confirmed. And that's just one project. Miss Voss has 3 more books under contract, plus international rights that we're still negotiating. 3. More books, Thaddeus repeated, and I could hear the envy creeping into his voice. That's incredible, Celeste. I mean, I always knew you were talented, but this... Always knew I was talented. The same brother who had mocked my writing phase for years, who had laughed about my ramen dinners just hours ago, was suddenly rewriting history in real time. We're so proud of you, Cordelia gushed, her voice pitched higher than usual with artificial enthusiasm. I can't wait to tell Reginald about this. He's always saying how important it is to support the arts. Support the arts. As if my commercial success was suddenly a noble cause they'd been championing all along. But it was Father's next words that made my blood run cold. Marcus, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what kind of business management does Celestine have in place? Financial planning, investment strategies, that sort of thing? Marcus glanced at me, clearly sensing the shift in the room's energy. Miss Voss has been quite sophisticated about her financial planning. She's worked with some excellent advisors. Advisors, Father nodded approvingly. Of course. Though I do hope she's getting proper guidance. The literary world can be so unpredictable. So many authors lose everything they make because they don't understand how to properly invest and protect their earnings. There it was. Less than 10 minutes after discovering I was successful, Father was already positioning himself as the expert I clearly needed. The daughter who couldn't be trusted. To manage her ramen budget was suddenly someone who required his sophisticated financial guidance. Actually, Vivienne interjected smoothly, This is wonderful timing. We've been discussing expanding the family foundation, maybe adding a literary arts component. Celestine, with your connections in the publishing world, you could be such an asset to that initiative. Asset. Not daughter, not person deserving of apology, but asset. Something valuable that could be leveraged for their benefit. And of course, Thaddeus added, if you're looking for real estate investments, I know the market better than anyone. Some of your earnings could be working much harder for you in commercial properties. They were circling like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. My success wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to manage, to redirect, to fold into their existing power structures where they could maintain control. You know, Cordelia said with sudden inspiration, we should announce this at the engagement party next month. Having a best-selling author in the family would be such wonderful publicity for the wedding. Very sophisticated. Publicity. My life's work reduced to a social media opportunity for her wedding planning. Marcus was watching this display with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of observing family dynamics around sudden wealth. But I could see the concern in his eyes as he witnessed my family's systematic reduction of my achievement into their own opportunities. The engagement party, Vivienne continued, warming to Cordelia's theme. Yes, that would be perfect. We could even arrange for some kind of reading, maybe invite some literary people, turn it into a real cultural event. Actually, Father said, his business mind clearly racing ahead, this could be excellent for the Voss brand overall. Literary success, cultural sophistication, it adds a whole new dimension to the family reputation. The Voss brand. That's what I'd become in the span of 10 minutes. Not a person who had achieved something remarkable despite their dismissal, but an asset to be incorporated into their public image. But it was Vivienne's next suggestion that made me understand just how completely they'd missed the point. Darling, you simply must move back to Millbrook Heights now. That little apartment in Brooklyn was fine when you were, well, when we thought you were struggling. But now that you're successful, you need to be somewhere that reflects your status. I know exactly the house. The Meridian estate just went on the market. Perfect for entertaining, close to the family. Move back to Millbrook Heights. Give up the independence I'd fought for, the life I'd built, the distance that had allowed me to create without their interference. Come back into their orbit where they could manage my success the way they managed everything else in their lives. We could help you with the transition, Father added. Handle the financial aspects. Make sure everything is structured properly. For tax purposes. Family business, family wealth. It all works better when it's coordinated. Coordinated. Managed. Structured. The language of control disguised as care. And Marcus, Vivienne turned to him with her most charming smile. We'd love to learn more about how we can support Celestine's career. Perhaps lunch next week? I have some ideas about how the family foundation could partner with literary organizations. Essoir was already trying to insert herself into my professional relationships, to position the family as patrons and supporters, rather than the people who had dismissed and belittled me for decades. I watched this performance with growing amazement. In less than 15 minutes, they had completely rewritten their relationship to my success. They weren't the people who had called my dreams fantasies. They were the sophisticated family who had always supported the arts. They weren't the ones who had told me I'd never amount to anything. They were the loving relatives who had been waiting for the right moment to publicly celebrate my achievements. The important thing, Father said, his voice taking on that paternal tone he used when he was about to dispense wisdom, is that we handle this properly. Success like this comes with responsibilities, expectations. You'll need guidance on how to manage your public profile, your business relationships. Fortunately, you have family who understand these things. Guidance, management, control. They were already planning how to fold my independent success back into their family structure, how to make sure that even my achievements served their purposes. But it was Marcus's expression that told me everything I needed to know. He was looking at me with something that might have been pity, the way you'd look at someone who was about to be devoured by predators too polished to show their teeth. Vivienne was still talking, spinning elaborate plans about foundation partnerships and cultural events when my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down at the screen and felt my heart stop. The message was from my editor at Beacon Press. Celestine, urgent. Someone claiming to be your mother just called our publicity department asking about coordinating family media appearances for your next book tour. Please call me immediately. They hadn't waited even 20 minutes. Before Marcus had finished explaining my success, before I'd had a chance to process their reaction, they were already working behind the scenes to insert themselves into my professional life. I looked up from my phone to find them all staring at me expectantly, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm they'd never shown for anything I'd done before. So, Vivienne said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, when do we get started planning your proper re-entry into society? The text message from my editor was like a bucket of ice water, washing away any lingering confusion I might have had about my family's sudden transformation. I stared at the screen, reading the words again. Someone claiming to be your mother just called our publicity department. 20 minutes. They'd given me 20 minutes of false warmth before moving to take control of my professional life. Looked up from my phone to find them all still watching me with that bright, expectant energy, like children who'd just discovered a new toy and were planning all the ways they could play with it. But now I could see it clearly. The calculation behind Vivienne's maternal smile, the greed lurking beneath father's concerned financial advice, the social climbing dressed up as family pride. Excuse me for just a moment, I said, standing and walking toward the large windows that overlooked their perfectly manicured backyard. I needed space to think, to process what was happening, to figure out how to respond to this masterclass in manipulation. Behind me, I could hear them murmuring, among themselves, probably strategizing their next moves, dividing up the various aspects of my success they wanted to claim. Vivienne would handle the social and cultural opportunities, Father would manage the financial aspects, Thaddeus would look for business partnerships, and Cordelia would mine it for wedding prestige. Marcus appeared beside me at the window. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Did you know? I asked him. When you were driving out here tonight, did you know this was what they were like? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I've been in this business for 15 years, Celestine. I've seen a lot of families react to sudden success, but I've never seen anyone pivot quite that quickly from dismissal to ownership. Ownership. That was exactly the right word. They weren't celebrating my success, they were claiming it. In their minds, I'd just become a Voss family asset that needed to be properly managed and leveraged. The phone call to your editor, Marcus continued, that was remarkably fast, even by industry standards. What should I do? That depends. Do you want a relationship with these people, or do you want your independence? The question crystallized everything. For years, I'd been holding on to some fantasy that if I just achieved enough, became successful enough, proved myself worthy enough, they would finally see me. Finally love me without conditions. Finally accept me as I was. But watching them tonight, seeing how quickly they'd moved from dismissing my dreams to trying to monetize my achievements, I realized I'd been chasing something that had never existed. Their love wasn't conditional on my success. It was conditional on my usefulness to them. I turned back toward the room where my family was still planning my future without me. Marcus, in your professional opinion, if I continue to let them insert themselves into my career, what happens? They'll gradually take control of every aspect of your professional life. Your publisher will start dealing with them instead of you. Your public appearances will be filtered through their social calendar. Your creative decisions will become family decisions. Within a year, you'll be a brand they manage rather than an artist who creates. A brand they manage, the fate that had befallen every other successful person who'd had the misfortune of being born into the Voss family. Father's business partners who'd found themselves gradually marginalized until they were employees rather than equals. Vivienne's friends who'd discovered that maintaining her friendship required constant deference to her opinions and needs. Looked at the earnings statement still lying on the coffee table. Concrete proof of what I'd accomplished without their help, despite their dismissal, in direct opposition to their predictions about my future. And I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. If I'd built this success while they were actively working against me, imagine what I could build now that I was free to build it entirely on my own terms. "Marcus," I said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff, "I need you to do something for me." "Of course. I need you to contact my editor, my publisher, my agent, everyone in my professional network. I want them to know that under no circumstances should any member of my family be given access to information about my contracts, my schedule, my plans, or my finances. Full communication lockdown." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's comprehensive." "It needs to be. These people don't take partial victories. If I give them an inch of access, they'll take complete control. Consider it done. Anything else?" I thought about the life I'd built in Brooklyn, my penthouse with its wall of windows overlooking the city, my office where I wrote surrounded by books I'd actually read rather than books chosen for their decorative value, my friends who knew me as Celestine the writer rather than Celestine the disappointing daughter. "Yes," I said. "I want you to document everything that happens here tonight. Names, dates, what they said about managing my career, their attempts to insert themselves into my business relationships. I want a record. May I ask why? Because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to tell them exactly what I think of their sudden interest in my success. And when they inevitably try to paint me as unstable or ungrateful, I want evidence of what really happened here." Marcus nodded slowly. "Smart. Very smart." I walked back toward the group, feeling something I'd never experienced in this house before. Complete control. Not the desperate, grasping control of someone trying to manage other people's reactions, but the quiet, centered control of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. They looked up as I approached, their faces bright with expectation. Father had apparently been outlining some kind of investment strategy because there were papers spread across the coffee table alongside my earnings statement. "So," Vivienne said with that performative warmth, "we've been making some preliminary plans. Nothing set in stone, of course. But we wanted to have some options ready for you to consider." Options. Plans they'd made for my life, my money, my career, in the 20 minutes since they'd discovered I was successful. "That's very thoughtful," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "But before we discuss any plans, I think we need to address a few things." "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" I picked up my phone and held it so they could see the screen. "I just received a text from my editor at Beacon Press. Apparently, someone claiming to be my mother called their publicity department tonight, asking about coordinating family media appearances for my next book tour." The silence that followed was profound. I watched their faces as they processed being caught, calculating whether to deny it, minimize it, or brazen it out. Vivienne chose brazen. "Well, yes, I did call them. I thought it would be helpful to introduce myself, let them know that you have family support for your career." "Family support," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call it when you contact my professional associates without my permission to insert yourself into my business relationships?" "Celestine," Father's voice carried that warning tone again. "There's no need to be dramatic. Your mother was simply being proactive." "Proactive," I said. "Like the way you were proactive about dismissing my writing for 28 years? Like the way you were proactive about telling me I'd never amount to anything just 3 hours ago?" The mask of family harmony was starting to slip. I could see irritation flickering behind Father's controlled expression, frustration tightening. the corners of Vivienne's smile. "We're trying to help you," Thaddeus said, and for the first time tonight, his voice carried some of its old condescension. "Success like this comes with complications. You need experienced people to guide you." "Experienced people," I said. "You mean like the experienced people who told me my dreams were fantasies? Like the experienced people who spent decades making sure I understood that my achievements didn't matter?" I turned to Marcus, who had been quietly observing this exchange with professional interest. "Marcus, in your experience, do successful authors typically need their families to coordinate their media appearances?" "Not in my experience, no. Most successful authors prefer to maintain control over their own professional communications." "Celestine," Vivienne's voice was losing its warmth, "we're your family. We want what's best for you." And that's when I finally understood the full scope of what was happening. They weren't trying to reconnect with me. They were trying to acquire me, like a company buyout disguised as a family reunion. "You want what's best for you," I said, my voice steady and clear. "And for the first time in my life, so do I." The silence stretched between us like a bridge that was about to be burned. I could see them processing my last statement. For the first time in my life, so do I. Trying to determine if this was still manageable rebellion or something more dangerous to their newly laid plans. Father was the first to recover, his voice taking on that measured tone he used in business negotiations when he sensed the deal slipping away. "Celestine, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions. We're not trying to control anything. We're offering support." "Support," I repeated, and I could hear something new in my own voice, a clarity that cut through years of practice. "Family diplomacy. Let me tell you what your support has looked like for the past 28 years. I walked over to the mantelpiece where family photos were arranged in perfect symmetry, the visual representation of the Voss family brand. When I was 7 and won the writing contest, your support was telling me that writing was nice but not important. When I was 12 and won the state poetry competition, your support was warning me not to get too focused on these little competitions." Vivienne shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Celestine, we were trying to help you develop realistic expectations." "When I was 16 and published my first story," I continued, not letting her finish, "your support was explaining that anyone could get something printed these days. When I won the Whitmore Fellowship at Yale, one of the most prestigious honors an undergraduate can receive, your support was reminding me that Dad had just closed a $12 million deal." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't seeking their approval or fearing their disappointment. I was simply stating facts. So forgive me if I'm a little confused about this sudden enthusiasm for supporting my career. Because from where I'm standing, your track record suggests that your support involves diminishing my achievements until they're small enough not to threaten your worldview. Thaddeus leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "That's not fair. We've always been proud of you." "Proud of me?" The laugh that escaped was sharp enough to cut glass. "Thaddeus, 3 hours ago you mocked my living situation and suggested I was eating ramen because I was a failure. Cordelia said my lifestyle was giving generational trauma. Father told me I'd never amount to anything. And you, Vivienne." I turned to my mother. "You called a mental health professional within an hour of my leaving this house to suggest I was having delusions of grandeur." The color drained from Vivienne's face. "How did you—" "Dr. Newberry called me. Apparently, you told her I was making grandiose claims about career success that didn't exist, that I was suffering from magical thinking and might need an intervention." The word hung in the air like a sword. Marcus, who had been quietly observing from his position near the window, straightened slightly. In the corporate world he navigated, the threat of having someone declared mentally incompetent was serious business. "Now," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, "less than 2 hours after learning that those grandiose claims were actually conservative estimates of my success, You're calling my publisher, making plans for my money, and suggesting I move back to Millbrook Heights so you can better manage my career. Father's mask finally slipped completely. The avuncular businessman disappeared, replaced by the cold strategist who had built an empire by never letting anyone else control the narrative. What exactly do you want from us, Celestine? His voice was ice. An apology? Fine. We're sorry we underestimated your success. But that doesn't change the fact that you're now in a position that requires sophisticated management, and we're offering to help. What I want, I said, is for you to understand that your help has never been about helping me. It's been about helping yourselves to whatever you thought you could extract from me. That's ridiculous, Cordelia started. Is it? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to another message that had come in while we were talking. Because I just received a text from the Millbrook Heights Country Club. Apparently, Vivienne called them 20 minutes ago to discuss hosting a literary salon in my honor. She told them I was considering moving back to the area and might be interested in becoming a cultural ambassador for the club. Vivienne's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Cultural ambassador, I continued. A role that would involve hosting events, bringing my publishing contacts to the club, essentially turning my professional network into content for your social calendar. I was simply exploring opportunities, she began. You were building? A cage, I cut her off. A very pretty, very prestigious cage, but a cage nonetheless. Move back to Millbrook Heights, let you manage my finances, coordinate my media appearances, host events at your country club, invest my money in Thaddeus's real estate deals. Let Cordelia use my success as wedding publicity. Within 6 months, you would have effectively nationalized my career. The room fell silent except for the sound of the grandfather clock marking time. I could see them all calculating, trying to determine if this was still salvageable, or if they needed to cut their losses and move to damage control. It was Father who made the decision. If that's how you see it, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict, then perhaps you should leave. Harrison, Vivienne said sharply, clearly not ready to abandon the strategy. No, he continued, standing up and straightening his jacket with sharp, angry movements. If Celestine thinks we're so terrible, if she believes we're trying to control her rather than help her, then she's obviously not ready to be part of this family's future. Part of this family's future. Not daughter, not person deserving of love and respect, but potential participant in their ongoing enterprise. You're right, I said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to surprise them. I'm not ready to be part of this family's future. I'm ready to build my own. Thaddeus shot to his feet. You're making a huge mistake, Celeste. You think you can just walk away from us? From everything this family represents? Everything this family represents, I repeated thoughtfully. You mean the conditional love, the systematic dismissal, the way you erase people who don't serve your purposes? You're right. I am walking away from that. You'll regret this, Cordelia said, her voice shaking with either anger or fear. When the literary world chews you up and spits you out, when you realize you need real support, we won't be here. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who shared my genetics, but had never once in our lives tried to understand who I was beyond what I could do for her. Cordelia, I said gently, you were never here to begin with. The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust. For 28 years, I'd been performing in a play where I was the only one who didn't know I was expendable. Where my role was to provide contrast, the failure that made their successes look brighter, the cautionary tale that justified their choices, the family disappointment that proved how much better they were at living. Marcus, I said, turning to the one person in the room who represented my actual life rather than the life they'd tried to impose on me. I think we're finished here. He nodded and began gathering his papers. Of course. I'll have those communication protocols in place by tomorrow morning. What communication protocols? Vivienne's voice was sharp with new alarm. I looked at each of them one final time. Father with his cold fury, Vivienne with her calculating concern, Thaddeus with his wounded entitlement, Cordelia with her bewildered anger. These people who had shaped my childhood, who had taught me that love was something you earned through performance, who had spent decades convincing me that their acceptance was worth any price. The protocols that ensure none of you ever have access to my professional life again, I said. My publisher, my agent, my editor, my film contacts, they'll all be instructed that under no circumstances should any member of the Voss family be given information about my work, my contracts, or my career. You can't do that, Father said, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew I absolutely could. I can, I said. And I am. I walked toward the front door, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the sound of finality. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversation, the family regrouping to figure out their next move. But for the first time in my life, their next move didn't matter to me, because I was finally, completely, irrevocably done playing by their rules. 3 weeks later, I was standing in the sunlit gallery space of the Brooklyn Public Library, watching a crowd of 200 people file in for the launch event of my new novel. The room buzzed with conversation, publishers, reviewers, fellow authors, readers who had followed my work for years, and journalists from major publications. Everything the Voss family had dismissed as little competitions and hobby writing had led to this moment. A major literary event that would be covered by the Times, featured in Publishers Weekly and live-streamed to thousands of viewers worldwide. Marcus stood beside me, impeccably dressed as always, reviewing the evening schedule on his tablet. The Times critic just arrived, he said quietly. And I see representatives from 3 major studios who've been following your work since the Netflix deal was announced. I nodded, feeling centered in a way I'd never experienced at family gatherings. This was my world, a world built on merit, creativity, and genuine relationships, rather than inherited obligation and performed affection. Miss Voss? A young woman with a press badge approached us. Jennifer Chen from Literary Review. Could we get a quick interview before the reading begins? As I spoke with Jennifer about my writing process, my inspirations, my upcoming projects, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the entrance. Dr. Patricia Newberry, the family therapist, was standing uncertainly by the welcome table, clearly out of her element in this literary crowd. I excused myself from the interview and walked over to her. Up close, she looked distinctly uncomfortable, as if she'd wandered into the wrong event entirely. Dr. Newberry, I said with genuine curiosity. This is unexpected. Are you interested in literary fiction? She had the grace to look embarrassed. Actually, Celestine, I came because, well, after our conversation 3 weeks ago, I did some research. I wanted to understand what I'd missed. And what did you find? Your books, your reviews, your awards, the Whitmore Fellowship. She paused, clearly struggling with something. I realized I made some serious professional errors in my assessment of your situation. It was a remarkable admission. Dr. Newberry was essentially acknowledging that she'd participated in gaslighting me based entirely on my family's narrative, without bothering to verify any of their claims about my life or career. I also discovered, she continued, that your mother has been less than truthful about several things. Not just about your circumstances, but about other family members as well. Before I could ask what she meant, she glanced around the room and lowered her voice. After our conversation, I started reviewing my notes from your family's sessions. There were inconsistencies I should have caught, stories that didn't align. And when I began doing some actual research rather than simply accepting your mother's version of events, she trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. Vivienne had built her entire social presence on carefully crafted narratives that positioned her as the sophisticated matriarch of a successful family. How many other people had she manipulated with selective truths and strategic omissions? Dr. Newberry, I said gently, I appreciate you coming to tell me this, but you should know that I'm no longer interested in family therapy or reconciliation. I understand, she said, but I wanted you to know that I've terminated my professional relationship with your family. What I participated in was unethical, and I take full responsibility for that. As she left, I felt a strange sense of validation. Here was a trained professional admitting that my family's behavior had been manipulative enough to fool someone whose job it was to recognize dysfunction. The evening's program began with an introduction from the library's director, followed by a reading from my new novel, a story about a woman who discovers that the family she'd spent her life trying to please had never actually seen her as a person worth knowing. The parallels to my own experience weren't accidental. As I read, I noticed movement near the back of the room. Thaddeus had slipped in during the introduction, standing awkwardly near the exit like he wasn't sure he should be there. He was alone. No Vivienne, no father, no Cordelia. Just my brother, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a room full of people who valued words and ideas over wealth and connections. After the reading, during the question and answer session, a woman in the front row raised her hand. Your work often explores themes of family expectation and individual identity. How much of your writing comes from personal experience? All of it, I said simply. I write about the tension between who we're told we should be and who we actually are. About the courage it takes to choose authenticity over approval. About the discovery that some people will only love the version of you that serves their needs. The applause was warm and sustained. These were people who understood the value of truth-telling, of using art to illuminate difficult realities. After the formal program ended, I was surrounded by readers wanting books signed, fellow writers discussing upcoming projects, and industry professionals talking about future collaborations. It was exactly the kind of community I'd been looking for my entire life. People who celebrated creativity, who understood that success in the arts required both talent and tremendous personal courage. Thaddeus lingered until most of the crowd had dispersed, then approached me hesitantly. Up close, he looked older than his 31 years, as if the past 3 weeks had aged him considerably. Celeste, he said, and I noticed he was using my full name for the first time in years. Could we talk? We found a quiet corner near the library's fiction section. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, clearly struggling with how to begin. I've been thinking about what you said, he finally managed. About us never really seeing you. And I've been trying to remember. When did we stop being real siblings and start being what mother and father wanted us to be? It was perhaps the most honest thing Thaddeus had ever said to me. I think, I said carefully, we were never really given the chance to be real siblings. We were cast in roles before we were old enough to understand what that meant. He nodded slowly. I've been successful my whole life without ever really succeeding at anything. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Thaddeus had been handed every advantage, every opportunity, every safety net. But he'd never experienced the particular satisfaction that comes from building something with your own hands, your own mind, your own vision. What you've built, he continued, gesturing around the library. This community, this career, this respect. I don't think I even know how to build something like that. It starts with being willing to fail, I said, and with caring more about the work than about what other people think of you doing the work. He was quiet for a long moment. Mother and father are furious, you know. They've been calling lawyers, trying to figure out if there's any way to challenge your communication restrictions. And they've been told that you have every legal right to control access to your own business relationships. They're not taking it well. I could imagine. For people accustomed to managing every narrative, controlling every outcome, my complete withdrawal from their influence must have felt like a personal betrayal. Cordelia's wedding is next month. Thaddeus said. "She's been telling people you're going through a difficult phase, that you'll probably come around once you realize you need family support." And what do you think? He looked around the library, at the books, at the lingering groups of people, still discussing literature and ideas, at the evidence of a life built entirely outside the Voss family sphere of influence. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've already found your family, and we were too busy managing our image to notice that we weren't part of it." When Marcus and I finally left the library that evening, walking out into the cool Brooklyn night, I felt something I'd never experienced after a family gathering: complete peace. No lingering guilt, no second-guessing my words or actions, no desperate hope that this time might be different. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked as we waited for our car. "Like coming home," I said. Finally. Behind us, the library glowed with warm light, and I could see through the windows that people were still gathered in small groups, still talking about books and ideas and the power of stories to transform understanding. It was a world where I belonged completely, without explanation or justification or the need to prove my worth. The daughter who had never been good enough for the Voss family had found her place in a community that celebrated exactly who she was. 6 months later, I was sitting in my home office in Brooklyn, watching the morning light stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The space was exactly what I'd always wanted: walls lined with books I'd actually read, a desk overlooking the city where millions of people were pursuing their own versions of authentic life, and the kind of silence that comes from living entirely on your own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor. "The review is up in the Times. Prepare yourself. It's extraordinary." I clicked the link she'd sent and found myself reading words I'd dreamed of since I was 7 years old, clutching that blue ribbon from the elementary school writing contest. "Voss has crafted a masterpiece of psychological insight," the review began. "Her ability to illuminate the complex dynamics of family manipulation while maintaining profound empathy for all her characters marks her as one of the most important voices in contemporary literature." One of the most important voices in contemporary literature. I read the phrase twice, letting it settle into the space where my father's words used to live. "You'll never amount to anything." The irony wasn't lost on me that the same week this review was published, I'd received a wedding invitation from Cordelia. The envelope had been addressed to the Voss family penthouse. They'd clearly done some research to discover where I actually lived. Inside, along with the ivory cardstock announcing her marriage to Reginald Ashworth III, was a handwritten note from Vivienne. "Darling, we've missed you terribly. Let's put this silly misunderstanding behind us. Family is forever. Love, Mother." Silly misunderstanding. That's how she'd characterized 6 months of my absence from their lives, 6 months during which my career had reached heights they couldn't have imagined. But then, they'd always been good at rewriting history to serve their current needs. I'd shown the invitation to Marcus during our weekly business meeting, and his reaction had been exactly what I'd expected. Professional concern mixed with personal protectiveness. "They're trying again," he'd said simply. "Different strategy, same goal." He was right, of course. The wedding invitation wasn't an olive branch, it was a new attempt at acquisition. They'd probably spent months crafting this approach, figuring out how to position my return as a magnanimous gesture on their part, rather than the capitulation it would actually represent. But what struck me most about receiving that invitation wasn't anger or hurt. It was complete indifference. The emotional charge that my family had carried for 28 years was simply gone. They'd become like characters in a book I'd finished reading, interesting in an academic way, but no longer relevant to my daily life. My laptop chimed with an incoming video call from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the therapist I'd been seeing since the ER night of the dinner confrontation. Elena was everything Dr. Newberry wasn't: curious rather than presumptuous, interested in understanding my reality rather than managing it. genuinely committed to helping me build the life I wanted rather than the life others expected me to want. "Congratulations on the Times review," she said when her face appeared on my screen. "How are you feeling about it?" "Peaceful," I said, and realized it was the perfect word. For the first time in my life, external validation feels like a bonus, rather than a necessity. That's significant growth. Tell me about that. I thought about how to explain the shift. I used to write hoping it would finally make them see me. Now I write because the stories need to be told. The recognition is wonderful, but it's not why I do the work anymore. And how does that feel? Like freedom, I said without hesitation. Like finally understanding the difference between performing for approval and creating from authenticity. After we finished our session, I walked out onto my terrace, looking out over the city that had become my true home. Brooklyn stretched out beneath me, a borough full of people who'd come here to build lives that couldn't be built anywhere else, who'd chosen possibility over comfort, creativity over conformity. My phone rang, and I glanced at the screen expecting to see Marcus or my editor or one of the other people who populated my actual life. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't seen in months. Father. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. Celestine. His voice carried the same controlled authority it always had, but underneath I could hear something new. Uncertainty. "Harrison," I said, using his first name deliberately. We were no longer in a parent-child dynamic where his authority was assumed. "I'm calling about Cordelia's wedding. Your mother is quite upset that you haven't responded to the invitation." "I'm not coming to the wedding." There was a pause. "Celestine, this has gone on long enough. You've made your point. You're successful, we understand that now. But this family estrangement is becoming embarrassing. Embarrassing. Not painful, not regrettable, not something he wanted to fix because he missed his daughter. Embarrassing. Harrison," I said, "I want you to understand something. I haven't been estranged from this family. I've been freed from it. There's a difference." That's a very dramatic way of looking at a simple family disagreement. Is it a simple disagreement when you spend 28 years systematically dismissing someone's dreams, then try to take control of their life the moment those dreams become profitable? Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had the edge that meant he was done pretending to be reasonable. "Fine. But don't expect any support from us when your little literary career inevitably falls apart. Success in the arts is notoriously unstable." There it was, the threat that was supposed to bring me back in line, make me reconsider the security of family connection over the uncertainty of independent life. The same threat he'd been wielding my entire life. "Harrison," I said. I stopped, needing your support the day I realized I was never going to get it anyway. I hung up before he could respond. That evening, I attended a dinner party hosted by my friend Sarah, a fellow novelist who'd become one of my closest confidants over the past year. The gathering was exactly the kind of event I'd always imagined when I dreamed of having a literary life. Writers, editors, poets, and artists sitting around a table discussing ideas, sharing stories, celebrating each other's successes without competition or jealousy. "I have an announcement," Sarah said as we were finishing dessert. "Celestine has agreed to be my maid of honor when James and I get married next spring." The table erupted in congratulations and excitement. These people, my chosen family, were genuinely thrilled for Sarah, genuinely happy to celebrate love and commitment when it was real rather than strategic. "Will your family be there?" asked David, a poet who'd heard enough of my stories to understand the situation. "They will," I said. "The family that matters." Later that night, as I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and a book by an author I genuinely admired, I thought about the invitations sitting on my kitchen counter. Cordelia's wedding would be everything she'd always wanted. Elegant, expensive, socially prominent, photographed for the society pages. It would be a perfect performance of success that meant absolutely nothing to me. I thought about the 7-year-old girl who'd sat in the back seat of her mother's Mercedes, touching her blue ribbon and hoping desperately that this achievement would finally make them see her worth. That little girl had deserved so much better than she'd received. But she'd also deserved the life I was living now. A life where success was measured by impact rather than image, where relationships were built on mutual respect rather than utility, where love didn't come with conditions and corrections. I picked up my laptop and began writing, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I had a story to tell. A story about a woman who'd spent decades trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it, and who'd finally discovered that the love she'd been seeking had been waiting for her all along, in her work, in her chosen community, in her own acceptance of who she was meant to be. Outside my windows, Brooklyn hummed with the energy of 8 million people building lives that mattered to them. And for the first time since that Thursday evening dinner 6 months ago, I felt completely, utterly, peacefully at home in my own life. Sometimes the greatest gift your family can give you is showing you exactly who you don't want to become. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to build something entirely different. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your integrity? Have you discovered that some people will only love the version of you that serves their needs? Your story matters. Your dreams matter. And you don't need anyone's permission to build a life that reflects who you really are. The daughter they said would never amount to anything had become exactly who she was meant to be, not in spite of their dismissal, but because of her refusal to accept it. Remember, you are not responsible for other people's inability to see your worth, but you are responsible for building a life that honors it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the "Mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out,"